been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Hey, welcome everybody. Steve with Sensus Fidelium coming at you with our continuous series on the councils of the church with Dr. Alan Fimister. Coming at you. It looks like it's sunny there behind you.
Yeah, I think it might just be the direction of the house.
It was a cool 90 degrees where I'm at right now.
No, it's terrible. Actually, it is very, very hot. It's very unpleasant. I'm used to my nice, soggy little island. This is very difficult for me.
Well, today we're bringing you the First Lateran Council. So, Doctor, sure. Show.
So it's a big jump from the Fourth Council of Constantinople to the First Lateran Council. It's the third longest gap between two ecumenical councils, I think, if I remember that rightly. Well, not two ecumenical. So there's, if you think about it, there's the Apostolic Council of Jerusalem, and then slightly less than 300 years later, you have the First Council of Nicaea, the First Ecumenical Council. And then they are relatively frequent intervals, about 100 years or so, or sometimes less, of the first 8 ecumenical councils after that. And then you've got about 250 years before Lateran I. And then there's lots of councils again, sometimes just every few decades, really, in the High Middle Ages, as they call it, the sort of glorious, most medieval part of the Middle Ages. And then you've got Trent, which ends in the 1560s, and then you don't have another ecumenical council until Vatican I in 1870. Well, it opens in 1868 or 1869 or something. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the bigger gaps, right? And the reason why there's such a big gap is because this is a huge seismic shift in the world, in the church, between the shift of power in the Christian world from the East and the surviving Roman Empire, what modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, sort of falls away as the most powerful force in the Christian world in favor of Western Europe, and all sorts of things go hand in hand with that. But one of them is that from the 12th century onwards, ecumenical councils start being held by popes rather than emperors, and they're held in the West, and they're held in Latin. And so we've got these 12 Latin councils and these 8 Greek councils at the beginning. So now we looked at last time about how Charlemagne, the coronation of Charlemagne 800, had kind of shattered the common worldview, or the more or less shared worldview of the Latins and the Greeks. I should say that the Byzantines or the Romans would have been very irritated to hear us call them Greeks. And after Charlemagne's coronation, we did start calling them Greeks quite often, and they did get very annoyed about it, because the Byzantines, when you said Greek or Hellene, Hellene being the Greek word for Greek, that for them that meant pagan. So they were Romans and Christians, and Hellenes was what they called pagans. So, but after we the Latins claimed to have the emperor now in the West instead, we started to call their guy the Emperor of Constantinople. That annoyed him quite a lot anyway, or the Emperor of New Rome. So the Emperor of New Rome was the least offensive, although still irritating. Emperor of Constantinople was a little bit more offensive. Emperor of the Greeks is like very offensive, and King of the Greeks, that is unbelievably so. So a variety of possible, but unless you called him Emperor of the Romans, basically they were not happy. So you've got this kind of running saw going on between the East and the West from this point onwards. And as I say, I very much suspect, I'm not alone in this, that the Photian Schism, which we were discussing last time, which was sort of, but not really entirely resolved by the Fourth Council of Constantinople, was really a kind of outbreak. It was able to burst into flame because of this subterranean rumbling annoyance, more than annoyance, anger and bitterness about what we tried to do in 800. But that didn't irrevocably destroy everything until the 11th century, when what's generally thought of as the Great Schism, which happened in 1054, broke out and was never fully properly resolved thereafter. And part of the reason for that was that everything fell to bits in the West in the meantime, and the Byzantines had a great period. So they had their kind of golden age, their post-classical golden age. So really, from the 4th century, it had been down for the Roman Empire, and they'd never really managed to fully, occasional slight haltings of the decline, but nothing major, really just smaller and smaller and smaller, until this dynasty founded by Basil the Macedonian, right, who we talked about last time, the one who was a bit like a sort of circus strongman, the one who killed Michael the Drunkard, who may or may not have been fairly described as Michael the Drunkard. And so his dynasty, it was a huge success, the Macedonian dynasty, and the empire started getting bigger and bigger again. And up until the second to last male ruler in that line, who was the Emperor Basil II, who reigned from 1076 until 1125. So he was around, not 976 to 1025. He was around for a long time, and he's known as Basil the Bulgar Slayer, because one of the many people that he beat big time in battle were the Bulgars, and he was very, very nasty to them. On one occasion, he defeated this Bulgarian army. He took vast numbers of them prisoner, and remember, it's the Bulgar Khan all those centuries before who turned the Roman emperor's head into a goblet. So there's a lot of bad feeling there. Basil II, he got all these prisoners, and he blinded all of them. I mean, there were like thousands of these prisoners, and he blinded 99 in every 100, and then let one of them keep one eye, so that they could all hold hands in groups of 100 and go back to the Bulgarian capital. And the king of the Bulgars, when they arrived, died of a heart attack from the shock of seeing his army.
Was there any marches on that one?
So I mean, they're ruthless, but they were doing pretty well. Like, they got Nazareth back at one point, and they had Antioch back for a good long while. And so I mean, the Byzantine Empire was really doing very nicely, thank you, in the 10th century. But the new Western version of the Roman Empire, led up by Charlemagne, completely blew up in the reign of Charlemagne's son. So one of the problems was that there was a tradition among the Franks that they always divided the inheritance equally between the surviving sons. And Charlemagne had actually been planning to do this himself. And he was going to divide his kingdom up between his 3 surviving sons. But 2 of them died. So in the end, it was passed on intact to his surviving son, Louis the Pious. But Louis the Pious had 2 wives, and the second and younger wife, I don't mean 2 simultaneously, sequentially, as a result of death, not dodgy Henry VIII type goings on. And there was a son born to the second wife, and he tried to alter the deal about how he's going to divide between his sons, and that led to a huge civil war. And there are all sorts of reasons why the Frankish Empire imploded. I mean, partly that the model by which it had increased in size to the point where Charlemagne became Roman Emperor was based on conquering things outside itself and handing goodies to your followers. So when it got to the kind of largest size it could reasonably get to, given the kind of level of bureaucratic sophistication and technology that they had, then that model by its own logic implodes into a civil war, if you see what I mean. So that was not very good. And so eventually it gets divided up in the 840s. It gets divided up into 3 different kingdoms. which are really the ancestors of the states of modern Europe. So the western part of it is Francia, Western Francia Occidentalis, is given to Charles the Bald, one of Charlemagne's grandsons, and that is where France comes from. The modern country of France is derived from Charles the Bald chunk of Charlemagne's empire. And then the eastern side is given to Louis the German, who you will not be surprised to learn is the ancestor of the modern German state. But then down the middle, you had this kind of strip, the eldest one, who was supposed to get it all, and who got the imperial title, who was called Lothar. He got kind of roughly this middle strip that's kind of like the Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, French provinces of Alsace-Lorraine, Switzerland, and northern Italy, roughly. This middle bit, middle Francia. And that was totally impossible to defend. So that didn't really survive. Although the province of Lorraine in France actually means the kingdom of Lothar, and it's named after Lothar's son, Lothar, who got, but it got pummeled between the eastern and western. So that's why you got these little states in the middle between France and Germany, if you see what I mean, because that middle kingdom was not defensible. So Europe degenerated into civil war, and at the same time, the Vikings from Scandinavia, who had not been evangelized, they came pouring in their longboats, and they were much scarier and nastier because the Germanic barbarians who originally brought down the Western Roman Empire, they were already Arian Christians on the whole by the time they took over the Roman provinces, whereas the Vikings were absolutely terrifying, completely awful, just kill, burn, rape, pillage. That was it. That's their modus operandi. And so that was a bit of a nightmare as well. And we talked last time about how the papacy was in trouble because they'd got this state in central Italy given to them by Charlemagne's dad, and they thought that that was going to kind of defend them from domination by external temporal rulers, which it did, but it caused them to become the puppets of the internal temporal rulers, the local Roman nobility. So from the poisoning of John VIII until the election of Saint Leo IX, who took possession of the Holy See in 1049, there was a pretty dreadful period, in fact, the worst period in the entire history of the papacy in terms of immorality, chaos, etc. And the first half of that period was the worst half, up until the 960s, when the then king of the German bit of Charlemagne's empire, Otto the Great, he came down to Italy and he took over the northern Italian fragment of that middle bit, and he had himself crowned emperor. And in fact, there hadn't been an emperor for a long time, getting on for 50 years or something. In the middle there, the imperial title had become, this revived imperial title had become a bit meaningless. It ended just being held onto by quite minor Italian rulers, and then it just went out of use altogether. And then this German ruler, Otto the Great, he managed to get himself crowned emperor, and he sort of permanently annexed northern Italy to the German bit of the fragments of Charlemagne's empire. And from that point onwards until the 19th century, the ruler of Germany was always the Holy Roman Emperor. Always had this revived imperial title that had been created by Leo III and Charlemagne, was held by the German ruler. Now, but it's a bit weird because he's not really ruling the Roman Empire. If again, this is a difficult concept to explain, but we talked previously about how after the Western Empire fell, the theory in the West was that they were holding their territories that they ruled, these kings, as sort of franchise owners from the mother company based in Constantinople. So you had the Roman state, the Roman polity, with its capital in Constantinople, with the CEO, the emperor, and then he had his franchises in the West, which were represented by the different kingdoms in the West. And then, as we talked about last time, the Franks had, as it were, bought up all the other franchises, or rather conquered all the other franchises in the West, so that they had more of the business than the original parent company. And then they claimed the title of emperor in 800. So, but they didn't own the parent company, if you see what I mean. The parent company was still the one based in Constantinople. So what happened was it became the convention in the West that the owner of the largest franchise, which is the German bit of that big agglomeration of franchises that Charlemagne had put together, would go down to Rome and get the title of Roman Emperor from the Pope. But there wasn't any actual polity that he ruled that was the Roman Empire. There was just the German kingdom. Although it gets called the Empire more and more as a sort of convenient term, but really what he is he's the king of the Germans, and then he goes down to Rome and he gets crowned by the Pope and he starts calling himself Emperor of the Romans from that point onwards. So if you look at these German rulers in the Middle Ages, you'll always have like a date when they became the king of Germany, and then sometimes quickly afterwards, sometimes not, sometimes decade or something or more, they managed to get down to Italy, central Italy, negotiate with the Pope, get themselves crowned, and from that point onwards they're emperor. But they don't really like that because they like the prestige of being emperor, so they like calling themselves king of the Romans in order to try and make them sound Roman right from the start. But the popes are not always happy with that. So, for example, Pope Gregory VII, who was particularly unenthusiastic about emperors, he would always call, I think it's Rex Teutonicorum, king of the Germans, he would call the uncrowned imperial candidate, just to rub in the fact that he wasn't the Roman emperor. But yeah, that varied as to, but nevertheless, so after Otto, so there's just an unbroken sequence of terrible popes from the poisoning of John VIII until Otto's crowned. He then deposes the guy who crowned him, John XII, who was elected pope when he was 18, turned the Lateran Palace into a brothel and died while committing adultery.
Yeah, I was going to say, he wasn't a good dude.
And I think Edward Gibbon, who albeit is quite anti-Catholic, mostly because he converted to Catholicism when he was a student and then apostatized because his dad threatened to disinherit him. So he had to explain why he was so pathetic by being very anti-Catholic for the rest of his life. But he says, I think if I remember right, he says about John XII, the reader will learn with surprise that virgins were deterred from praying at the shrine of St. Peter for fear of being deflowered in the act by his successor. So that's, so not good. And there's this guy, Luterprand of Cremona, who's a bishop / diplomat of that period, and he has some pretty grim descriptions of John XII's antics.
Imagine the blogosphere then.
Well, indeed, yes. And he has this great list of all the terrible things that he did, sort of diabolism, witchcraft, adultery, rape, God knows what else. And then the last thing on the list, if I remember rightly, is, and sometimes he would even omit to say matins. So that's the climactic. So you're thinking, like, how bad are things now if even at the darkest era of the papacy, the popes only occasionally omitted to say matins. But anyway, yes. So from that point onwards, you generally had, if the emperor really controlled Germany, and then he kind of had a nominal rule over northern Italy, but he didn't really rule it unless he was actually there with a big German army, in which case, yes, everyone did what he said until he left, and then they got back to doing whatever the hell they liked, as the Italians generally do. So when the German emperor, and that's kind of why these Italian little city-state republics that were so important in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance arose, because they created their own little governments in all these towns. It was the one big surviving urban area in the West was Italy. Everywhere else it had gone back to becoming very agrarian during the period of the barbarian invasions. So, but anyway, so while the German emperors were down there, well, they weren't the German emperors, misleading term, but while the king of Germany / Holy Roman Emperor / King of the Romans, depending on what he was being called at the time and whether he'd been crowned by the Pope or not, while he was down there in northern Italy, they would make sure the popes were reasonably okay guys. And as soon as they left, the dodgy local Roman nobility would get some deranged teenager back onto the papal throne. So it's a weird period. The second half of this dreadful period is one where you do have these kind of German bureaucratic, respectable popes alternating with the kind of sex-drunken rock and roll popes. And this carries on until the period 1046 to 1048, roughly. And it sort of climaxes in this dreadful Pope, Benedict the Ninth, who sells the papacy to his uncle, abdicates, is deposed. He has his pontificate occurs on 3 different occasions because his pontificate is so ridiculous, but eventually they finally get rid of the guy, and this Alsatian, not in the sense of the dog, but of somebody from Alsace, is nominated by the Emperor Henry III to go down and become Pope Leo IX. And he on his way down, he bumps into this guy Hildebrand, who's a deacon from Rome, and he was a friend of Pope Gregory VI. Pope Gregory VI was the uncle of the terrible Pope, and he actually bought the papacy off Benedict IX because he thought his nephew was so terrible. And his nephew was such a bad man that he'd probably be willing to sell the papacy. And if that's the only way of getting the idiot out of the throne of St. Peter, then it's worth it. So Gregory VI, who was actually a good guy, bought the papacy of his nephew in order to save us all from this dreadful man. And but then that became a bit of a problem because that's Simony, right? And one of the major abuses in the church at that time was Simony selling ecclesiastical offices. And so he was kind of compromised. He couldn't really be the leader of a great reform because he was compromised by having bought papacy, even though he did it for the best of reasons. So he accepted that, and he abdicated, and he went off to Northern Europe, and he took his pal Hildebrand, the deacon, with him, who felt sorry for him.
Was there anybody that said later that he was the true pope 5 years later?
Yeah, he is listed as a true pope.
No, I mean after the next one. So no, he's not the real pope now. He's still the pope.
Oh well, no, because he himself he voluntarily abdicated because he thought, you know, he accepted that the shady circumstances in which he became pope were, albeit he did it for a good reason, it was still a bad thing. So yeah. You know, so Hildebrand had been knocking around there in Northern Europe, possibly had become a monk of Cluny. Now we'll get to Cluny and why it's so important in a sec, but it's not clear if he was or not. There's some claims that he was. But anyway, Hildebrand bumped into Leo IX, who'd just been nominated by the Emperor Henry III and was on his way down to Rome. And Hildebrand persuaded him that he shouldn't treat himself as Pope until he'd been properly elected according to the proper traditional rules by the Roman clergy and people in Rome. So he didn't, and he went down very humbly in sort of pilgrim fashion and submitted himself to election by the people and the clergy of Rome, and they elected him. And so his pontificate, and he brought Hildebrand with him, and his pontificate is seen as the beginning of this thing called the Gregorian Reform Movement, which is this massive movement to reform the church after this terrible, terrible period of corruption and collapse. And it's called the Gregorian Reform Movement after Pope Gregory VII, who is in fact Hildebrand. So many pontificates later, Deacon Hildebrand was actually elected Pope, but he'd been the kind of guy behind the throne, as it were, promoting the theory of this reform the whole time. So the whole reform movement is named after him, and his pontificate became the period of the greatest tension with the lay power over the ideals of the Gregorian Reform Movement. But the first pontificate of the Gregorian Reform Movement is the pontificate of Gregory IX, which begins with his arrival in Rome in 1049. So Cluny, why is Cluny important? So in the middle of the most terrible part of the most terrible period, more or less, in 910, a Duke William of Aquitaine founded this Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy in France. And now Charlemagne, once he became Roman Emperor, he was very keen on making everything be really Roman and making everything sort of uniform. And in a way, we get the sort of Roman Rite in its current form, by which I mean the extraordinary form. I don't mean the 1960s thing. But so in the form that it existed, as far as we can tell, from the reign of Charlemagne until the 1960s, or arguably till now, is really a result of Charlemagne's desire for Romanness and uniformity, because he wanted to know what the Roman way of mass being celebrated was, and that was investigated, and that led to a sort of gathering of liturgical texts and a crystallization of the form of the Roman Rite. But one of the other effects of this was he became worried about the fact that all the different monasteries were all following lots of different rules or just making it up as they went along and all that kind of thing. And he wanted them to be uniform and he wanted them to be Roman. And so he decided, because Gregory the Great is like the greatest of all popes, as we've mentioned in the past, and Gregory the Great is the source for the life of Saint Benedict. Book 2 of Gregory the Great's dialogues is entirely devoted to Saint Benedict and what a great guy he was. And so St. Benedict is seen as the ultimate Roman monk. And so the rule of St. Benedict is seen as the ultimate Roman rule for monks. And so there are a number of synods that Charlemagne holds and that Louis the Pious, his son, holds, in which it becomes established in the West that you're only a monk if you're a Benedictine, i.e. you're only a monk if you follow the rule of St. Benedict. And they can't get rid of the rule of St. Augustine because he's too prestigious. That'd be a bit silly to say, oh, it's no good, this rule of St. Augustine, who's that Augustine guy anyway? You can't say that, it's ridiculous. So, but they insist that people who follow the rule of St. Augustine call themselves canons rather than monks. So they really insist on this. So there's this period from around, this apogee of Charlemagne's reign at 800 until the 12th century, really, when the rule of St. Benedict, followed very strictly, is the ultimate ideal for the West. But that's not what's actually happening in the West. What's happening is married lay abbots who are controlling abbeys because they want to control the property of the abbey and all that kind of stuff, and lots of very poor observance and all this kind of stuff. And it's all dominated by the families who donated the original land. But a line is drawn onto this with the founding of Cluny in 910 by this Duke William of Aquitaine, because Duke William of Aquitaine arranges for Cluny to be immune from two different types of interference, in inverted commas. First of all, he says that he and his family will not have any power over the monks. They'll just follow the rule of St. Benedict, elect their own abbot, and that's what they're going to do. And they're going to pray for William of Aquitaine and his descendants, but they're not going to. But William's family aren't going to control the abbey, so they're going to be genuinely autonomous. So that's a really big deal. Also, he manages to arrange for Cluny to be immune from the power of the local bishops and only subject to the Pope. And what that does, it basically creates the first ever religious order in the sense that we understand it now. So back then, religious order meant an order in society, like a group in society, like knights or virgins or kings or whatever would be an order, and a religious order would be an order that took vows, right? Vows to God. And so it didn't mean some kind of a big organization with an HQ in Rome and all wearing a similar outfit. That's a result of Cluny, basically, that conception of what we mean by a religious order. Because prior to Cluny, an abbot in one diocese couldn't start telling a religious house in another diocese what to do, because that would be violating the jurisdiction of the bishop of that other diocese. If that makes any sense. But now, because Cluny's immune from the diocesan bishop's authority and only subject to the Pope, it means that Cluny can set up little satellite houses. And the reason why that happens is because everyone sees that Cluny is very observant. They're particularly punctilious about the liturgy, and they want that. They think, well, these useless monks who don't follow the rule and whose abbot is a layman, they're supposed to be praying for the souls of my ancestors, but that's a bit useless, isn't it? I mean, God's not going to be interested in their prayers. So they think we want an abbey like that. We want an abbey like that in next to us, praying for us instead. Mm-hmm. So they ask Cluny to send out chaps to reform their local abbeys all over Europe, and then when they finished reforming them, the Cluniacs, as they're called, the monks from Cluny, they don't restore an abbot to that abbey. They just leave a prior, and a prior is appointed, is like the number 2 to the abbot, but he's appointed by the abbot. He isn't elected by the monks. So they made all the monks in the reformed house be monks of Cluny, even though they lived hundreds of miles from Cluny or whatever. And then they'd be governed by a prior nominated by the abbot of Cluny. So for the first time, you have this kind of federation, albeit it's a kind of imperial federation, but a federation of religious houses crossing over diocesan boundaries. And so Cluny becomes this big ideal, and it's Cluny that inspires the Gregorian Reform Movement, and lots of the big figures of Gregorian Reform Movement are either monks of Cluny or they're monks of Monte Cassino, the original Abbey of St. Benedict, which itself is reformed in the light of the ideals of Cluny. So Monte Cassino and Cluny become these big centres of this ideal of monastic reform. But it also, part of the ideal, because of William of Aquitaine's self-denying ordinance, part of the ideal is that the laity not be able to interfere, in inverted commas, in the elections of not just abbots but bishops, because what the Gregorian Reform Movement is a translation of the ideals of Cluny into the organisation of the clergy as opposed to the religious, and part of that becomes a great hostility to the involvement of lay people in the election of bishops. Now, of course, the reason for that is because the laity have the lay role in the election of bishops has become, particularly in Rome, but elsewhere as well, has basically become essentially appointment by local aristocrats or appointment by the local king or by the Roman aristocracy or whatever. It's not really it's not really the kind of election, popular election that existed in the ancient world, albeit they could get pretty rowdy as well. But as a result, this idea that the lay role, so it's a bit of a poison chalice. It should be said, however, that the actual leaders of the Gregorian Reform Movement at the time, in the 11th century, they didn't say that the people shouldn't have a role in electing the bishop, but it eventually goes that way. And of course, they never really had much of a role anyway north of the Alps, because the idea of the people voting for the bishop is very much an urban idea. You know, it happens in a big city with a big cathedral with a square in front of it. If it's a massive diocese in England or northern France or something, and people aren't living in people aren't living in cities, they're peasants out in the countryside. So in those places, the old patristic model had never really been established anyway. These, as a result of the intervention of these emperors from Germany, you eventually get a sequence of morally good, reform-minded, zealous popes inspired by the ideals of Cluny, and they want to get rid of improper lay interference in the appointment of bishops, that becomes. That paradoxically or ironically turns round so that it causes a huge conflict between the emperors from Germany and the popes, because these emperors who'd created this reform movement, in a certain sense, were now seen as objectionable by the reform movement, because the idea that the emperor could just appoint the pope was seen as just another instance of this inappropriate lay interference in episcopal elections. So it's remarkable in some ways that these popes, these reform popes, very rapidly acquire a very strong sense of the infallibility of the pope, of the indefectibility of the Roman Church, of the importance of these free elections, but also of the power of the pope to just drop in a bishop from anywhere in order to deal with inappropriate elections. And it's no coincidence that in the reign of Pope Leo IX, the Great Schism with the Byzantine Church happens, because the papacy is now throwing its weight around and is very conscious of its papal powers and prerogatives, and this leads to a clash with Byzantium, which still considers the Pope, the Latins in general, to be this pathetic, barbarous people that they're not really interested in, and that they're very grudgingly accepting the nominal seniority of the Bishop of Rome, and there's a sort of shift. The early emperors in Constantinople always used to refer to Rome as the elder and the greater Rome, and they start changing that to the elder and the lesser Rome. So they're no longer being properly deferential to the original capital of the empire. And so it would take too long to go into the circumstances which triggered off the excommunications of 1054. But it was the kind of the zeal and sense of their prerogatives that suddenly manifested itself in these Gregorian Reform popes, which helped to push the question to a huge row. It seems to be that there'd already been some kind of quarrel that's lost in the mists of that last period of papal anarchy, because already for a while before that, the schism of 1054, the Byzantines had stopped praying for the Pope in the liturgy, and we've never really been able to put our fingers on why that happened. Nobody seems to have been lost as to why it happened. But it is interesting, we talked last time about how the Filioque wasn't said in the liturgy in Rome because they didn't sing the creed in the liturgy in Rome, and that ended in the year 1014 because the Emperor Henry II, Saint Henry II, he came to Rome to be crowned by the Pope, and I don't know, the liturgy committee or something started discussing the arrangements for the coronation, and Henry II was like, "Why is there no creed? I love the creed. I want the creed in there." And so they were kind of like, "Oh, okay, well, we don't really do that." And he's like, "Oh, no, you can't have a mass without a creed." And so they put the creed in to please Henry II, and because the only versions of the creed for singing in the mass were from the Franks, and they all had the Filioque in, and probably because of the growing estrangement between East and West, they didn't know, like Leo III did back in 800, that this was going to cause a huge row with the Byzantines. So they just sang the creed with the Filioque in it and never looked back. But of course, from the Byzantine point of view, that's kind of because the Filioque question was never properly resolved at the Fourth Council of Constantinople. So it could be to do with that, or it could be some other dispute. It's not completely clear. But anyway, so the Great Schism happens. And now the emperor I mentioned, who originally nominated Leo IX, was Henry III, and he died in 1056. So he was succeeded by his son, who was just a kid at the time, the king of the Germans, Henry IV, usually referred to as the Emperor Henry IV, although actually he was only ever crowned by an anti-pope. But he so there was a sort of gap as a result. So there was no imperial supervision of papal elections because the emperor was a kid. But unlike in the previous century, this didn't lead to it flipping back to dodgy local Roman aristocrats controlling papal elections. The Gregorian Reform Movement had progressed enough that the local Roman clergy were controlling papal elections instead. And so that there was a sequence of papal elections in which the court in Germany was not consulted about who should become pope. And this slowly began the emancipation of the papacy from imperial control. And so nominally, ever since the time of Justinian, the Pope had to have imperial ratification. The guy elected Pope had to have imperial ratification in order to become Pope. That initially meant the Byzantine emperors, and then later on these Western Holy Roman emperors. But from this point onwards, they begin to emancipate themselves from that. Now, they never actually get rid of, absolutely speaking, the imperial veto. which is that if the emperor gets, or his representative gets to the conclave in time, they can say, "Oi, we're not having him." So that actually remains in place, and that's not just an abuse. That the idea is that the temporal ruler of Rome is the emperor, and the temporal ruler in Christendom is the senior ranking representative of the laity. So just like the assembled lay faithful in the square, as it were, have a proper role in the election, so too some kind of veto or nomination power should exist in the lay ruler, which in the case of the papacy is the emperor. And in fact, the last time that veto was used was, guess when? Go on, guess. I bet you know, actually.
We did it was 2 episodes ago, right?
Did we? I've forgotten.
I think
1903.
Oh, 1903 was the answer?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's what I was thinking.
Oh, very good. So yeah, there was a Polish.
That was Pius X.
The Secretary of State was vetoed by the Emperor Franz Joseph in 1903, and that was the last time. In fact, Pius X abolished the imperial veto, but that was the last time the imperial veto was ever used. So they didn't actually remove the imperial veto altogether, just like they also didn't remove the role of the lay faithful in the elections, although effectively that's what happened. But but they just got on with the elections before the emperor could find out about it, and this was sort of crystallized by Pope Nicholas II. Lots of popes in this period are the second because, inspired by the Reform movement, they like to take the names of ancient and holy popes who usually hadn't had a successor with the same name. So you got loads and loads of the second during the high point of the Gregorian Reform Movement. But Pope Nicholas II, he issued this constitution. He held a synod in the Lateran in 1059 called. It issued this constitution called In Nomine Domini, which created, it restricted the clerical vote in papal elections to the cardinals. Mm-hmm. But the cardinals are supposed to be the Roman clergy. They're supposed to, like you've got cardinal bishops, cardinal priests, and cardinal deacons, and they're supposed to be the bishops of the diocese around Rome and the parish priests or pastors of the diocese of Rome. And then the I think 7, if I remember rightly, I'm not wrong, the 7 deacons of the Roman Church who run the dicasteries, right, which means the diaconal departments of the Roman Church. And so that's why when somebody becomes a cardinal, they're the cardinal priest of X or the cardinal bishop of Y. So they're supposed to be the Roman clergy. Of course, very unfortunately, relatively rapidly, they become sort of, little princelings who have nothing to do with the parish church or very little to do with the parish church that they're supposedly the parish priest of. But anyway, so in order to try and prevent anarchy and to prevent inappropriate lay interference, this constitution clarifies the clerical role in the papal election as being vested in the cardinals. So another big issue which kicks off in this period is the question of clerical celibacy. Mm-hmm. So clerical celibacy has not been doing very well during this period of anarchy, and there's loads of priests who have supposed wives or are living with concubines or whatever. And so the Gregorian reformers, they're very keen. They want to stamp out simony. They want to stamp out inappropriate lay interference. They want to stamp out clerical marriage. They also, William of Aquitaine, when he founded Cluny, he took the title Advocate of Cluny. So meaning he's not the ruler, he doesn't get to nominate the abbot or anything like that. He's just that he's helpfully defending the interests of Cluny to the rest of the lay world without claiming any kind of power over it. And that's how the Gregorian reformers see the role of the lay ruler, which is to be the defender of the spiritual power within that particular part of Christendom. Now, the problem is that after the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, the Carolingian Empire, as it's called, Europe had collapsed into this kind of little pockets, essentially a sort of mafia type system of government, where the local hard man either sets up a protection racket because he's a horrible man, or because he's a good guy and there's nobody protecting the ordinary peasants, he starts protecting them, but he needs to be, provided with produce in kind. So it's either a nasty protection racket or it's a nice protect, but it's effectively the same form of organization either way. And just like the mafia, they kind of organize themselves into this kind of pyramid federations of local hard men with kind of local leaders, and then the boss, and then the boss of bosses. Right? So it's very much, in fact, I have a friend who's now a nun, and she used to teach medieval history in a Scottish university, and she used to recommend that her students watch the first two Godfather films in order to understand the nature of feudalism. Because that's kind of how it works.
Did they have cannolis in medieval Italy?
Probably, I'm sure they did. In fact, the opening speech of the first Godfather movie is a really good explanation of feudalism, because you've got kind of, I don't know if you remember, it's the guy, I believe in America. It's the undertaker whose daughter is beaten up by the two horrible blokes, and he thought the police and the courts would deal with them, and they don't. Mm-hmm. and so instead he turns in despair to Don Corleone and asks him to give him justice instead, and that's kind of what you've got going there. There's the objective state, which looked like it might revive under Charlemagne but doesn't, collapses. And so there aren't, as the guy in The Godfather says, Don Corleone says, you had police to protect you and courts of law. He says, that's why you never came to me. But they don't have that, they don't have this objective state to protect them in Western Europe in this period of anarchy. And so they turn to this kind of pyramids of this mafia system, pyramids of hard men. And one of the problems or difficulties or whatever you want to call it with that is that it means that if you own this area, right, you're the local hard man there, and you kind of sort of own the land, but the people on the land get to keep the produce. They work on it, but they give you some of the produce, but they're not necessarily allowed to move off the land. So the ownership of land and actual governance are not properly distinguished, okay, in this system. So you can't really, which makes it tricky, because that then means that because the bishop owns a bunch of land, he ends up in this system also kind of being the temporal ruler of that, because land ownership and civil power have sort of become the same thing. And you've also got to bear, and the bishops are already very, in a way they almost never were in Byzantium. There are some cases. The Patriarch of Alexandria was the governor of Egypt at one point, a very low point in the history of the Byzantine Empire. But generally, bishops did not exercise temporal power in Byzantium. But in the West, that had become all really, really, really entangled, because the bishops were the people who were left behind anyway after everyone else fled. Every other literate person, apart from the bishops and the monks, fled in the face of the barbarian invasions. So the bishops were already quite powerful. A lot of Italian towns were kind of ruled by their bishops until they set up their little republics in the way that we were describing. And this becomes even more intractable in Western Europe because of the fact that this system where land ownership and political power are sort of the same thing. And also, you've got to bear in mind, a lot of these people are illiterate. So when you get land ownership, of course they do have charters and things to witness land ownership, but formal symbolic rituals become a really big deal for showing who owns some land, and therefore who is the kind of feudal ruler of that land, because both the rulers and the peasants can't really read and write. And you can see, I mean, even back in Bede's day, I believe there's a letter where Bede complains that he found a copy of the Roman canon, which some illiterate priest had thought was a charter for the land in his parish, and so he'd added to the list of saints the names of local potentates, not because he thought they were saints, but because he wanted to make it look as if there had been an impressive list of witnesses to the charter, right? So things, and so one of the structures which is built up as a result of this weird set of circumstances is that if I was in, say I am the count of something or other, and you are the local baron or whatever, and I am investing you with some bit of land, or local seigneur, and I'm investing you with a bit of land, and we're both illiterate. So what happens is this ceremony in which I would give you something that symbolizes that bit of land would take place. And that wouldn't just be like a nice little frilly extra ceremony. That would actually be what meant that you got that land, right? I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah, so yeah. You can actually see this. This happens often on jubilees of current British monarchs. There's a case where this still happens because, of course, there not ever having been a definitive kind of overthrow of the monarchy or anything in Britain, we still have there's still quite a lot of this feudal stuff still lurking around, even though it doesn't have much genuine impact, but it's still there. So the Corporation of London, which is the guilds that owned London, they were the feudal owners of the city of London, which is like the square mile in the middle of the massive current modern city of London, is the old Roman city, which is where St Paul's Cathedral and the Stock Exchange and everything is. And that's called the City of London, confusingly. And that's actually ruled by the Corporation of London, which was actually all the guilds in London. And but it's actually all stockbrokers and bankers now, but supposedly they're actually tailors and grocers and things. And when the Queen goes in there in a really ceremonial way, so she goes in a big coach to St Paul's Cathedral, she stops. There's this bit, if you're walking down, I think it's Fleet Street, there's this bit where you cross over from the city of Westminster to the city of London, and when the Queen crosses there on a ceremonial occasion, she stops her coach, and the Lord Mayor of London kneels down next to the door of the coach, and some flunky opens the door of the coach, and the Lord Mayor has this pearl encrusted sword, which is the token which symbolically invests the Corporation of London with the land of the City of London from the boss of bosses in England, who is the Queen. And so the Lord Mayor kneels down next to this. This really happens. I remember seeing this. I didn't see it in the flesh, saw it on the telly, but I remember seeing this in the Queen's Golden Jubilee years ago. And the Lord Mayor kneels down and he lifts up his pearl-encrusted sword through the door of this coach, and the Queen sort of lifts her hand out and touches the edge of the pearl-encrusted sword to indicate that he can still keep it, and he then takes it back, and that shows that she hasn't come to London to try and take it back from the Corporation of London. So it's a symbolic reenactment of the investing of the Corporation of London with that bit of chunk of feudal territory of the City of London, right? So that's a weird survival of this custom built into the feudal system, which developed in the rubble of the Carolingian Empire. So now, why is this all connected to the First Lateran Council? Well, the reason why is because in Germany, the king, the local rulers were very, very powerful, and the king, the German king, who was the emperor most of the time, was not really able to control them as much as he would like. But there were also lots and lots and lots of bishops, and they were also very, very powerful, and they had lots and lots of land. And he could control the bishops, the appointment of the bishops, because the popes weren't doing anything to stop him, and it had been going on for years, and he basically got to appoint the popes anyway. So a lot of the power of the emperor as king in Germany came from the fact that he could at least control the bishops. And in fact, in the later Middle Ages, there were these 7 electors who would elect the king in Germany, who would become the emperor, and 3 of the 7 were bishops: the Archbishop of Mainz, the Archbishop of Trier, and the Archbishop of Cologne. And that reflects how powerful and important the episcopacy was, and how vital it was to the strength and the position of the emperor in Germany. But in order to show that he was giving them this power, and that they jolly well were answerable to him, he needed to do something to show that he was making them bishops. And giving them this land which they had as bishops. And so the equivalent of this pearl-encrusted sword for German bishops was the ring and crozier. So this ceremony of investiture would occur, which at the time of the appointment of a bishop in Germany, the emperor would stick the episcopal ring on the finger of the candidate and give him his crozier in order to invest him as bishop, to show that he'd been given all that territory and land and power by the emperor, and that was very important to the emperor and to his position. But to the But to the Gregorian Reform Movement, that was absolutely unthinkable and absolutely terrible. And how could that possibly happen? And this was Simony, basically. Which was the number one thing they were most furious about. This was receiving a spiritual office from a temporal ruler. So they were absolutely determined to get rid of this. And it wasn't that wasn't prominent with Leo IX, but it builds up more and more, especially once Hildebrand himself becomes Pope Gregory VII in 1073. Now, one other thing that stirred into the mix here is this idea about the role of the lay ruler as the kind of right hand of the spiritual ruler is slowly creating this idea of sort of consecrated warfare. So under Pope Alexander II, who's one of these reform popes, in 1066, the Duke of Normandy, William Duke of Normandy, who's actually descended from one of these Viking pagans who trashed the Carolingian Empire, who was bought off in 886 or 887 or something like that, was bought off with a chunk of land, which is now called Normandy, the land of the Northmen. So it means the land of the Vikings. The Vikings have been besieging Paris, and most of them, they managed to get most of them to go away, but one of them, Rollo, wouldn't go away. And so they said, okay, look, convert to Christianity, we'll give you the territory at the mouth of the Seine River, right? You can have that as yours. You can be duke of it, as long as you keep out any more of your wretched pagan burning and pillaging cousins from sailing down the Seine. So he's like, okay, I'll do that. So he gets baptized and he takes over. So this Duchy of Normandy becomes a really big deal because they're the scary new generation of scary pagan warriors who've now become Christians. And anyway, this William Duke of Normandy, who's his descendant, he wants to claim the throne of England for complicated reasons we haven't got time to go into. But his main rival candidate is this guy, Harold Godwinson. And he had got shipwrecked off the coast of Normandy a little bit earlier, and had sworn an oath on holy relics that when the reigning King of England, Edward the Confessor, died, that he, Harold, would support William, Duke of Normandy's claim to the throne, because Edward the Confessor was so holy that he had a Josephite marriage and didn't have any kids. Mm-hmm. So everybody knew there was going to be a succession crisis when he died. So Harold swears this oath, and then instead, when Edward the Confessor dies, Harold has himself made king in England, and William of Normandy sends off to the Pope and says, this isn't fair. He swore an oath on holy relics. It's terrible, Your Holiness. You've got to help me out here. I'm fighting the cause of rightness and justice. And so the Pope sends the banner of the Roman Church to William of Normandy to show that he's fighting on behalf of the ideals of the Gregorian Reform Movement in conquering England, which he successfully does. And there's even a possibility that that banner of the Roman Church, there's some circumstantial evidence to indicate that it was a horizontal red cross on a white background, which is actually to this day the English flag. So it's it may well be that the English flag is actually the flag of the Papacy in the 11th century, but you can't absolutely prove that. But there's quite a reasonable amount of circumstantial evidence for that. But anyway, so they've got this idea of. They're trying to, obviously the lifestyle, I'm getting into Godfather Part 3 here really, the lifestyle of these hard men is not good, right? It's not a holy lifestyle, right? It involves, machine gunning people down in restaurants and all that kind of stuff. And what was it Michael Corleone says, I try to get out, but they pull me back in or whatever. So there's this problem that they have, which is that they all think they're going to hell. And this is a really big problem. Modern historians are very eloquent on this subject, is that the aristocracy of Western Europe live this lifestyle where you have to be this hard, nasty, murdering mafiosus, whatever the singular is. Otherwise your family's going to get trashed. But how you are going to avoid being damned on that basis? And so what they do is they build loads of monasteries, and they can't, because see, indulgences don't really exist at this point, because they don't have they don't know where they do exist, but they don't exist in the way they do now. You can't just go to the local local parish and pray the rosary and yay, plead indulgence. Most people are living under the penitential discipline of the church. They're actually supposed to be fasting on bread and water for years, every time they commit a murder or commit adultery or whatever. And that's not how the mafia lifestyle works. You can't do that. So what they do is they found loads of monasteries, hope that the monks are going to pray for them, and then if they get absolved a few seconds before they die, so that it doesn't affect the family fortunes.
I'm doing this for the family.
Exactly, that's right. It's not personal; it's strictly business. Do you renounce Satan and all his work? I do renounce him. Anyway, it's a bit of a scary kind of tightrope act to try and pull that one off. So it's great for founding monasteries, though. Now, the year before Gregory VII becomes Pope, the Byzantine Emperor is captured in a horrific defeat called the Battle of Manzikert in 1072. Then they're really, really badly done in by the Turks, and anarchy ensues, and a huge, about half of, going on 2/3 of Asia Minor, what's now Turkey, which has been the mainstay of the Byzantine Empire for all these centuries, falls into the hands of the Turks, and that's why it's called Turkey to this day, basically because of that battle. By the end of the century, the Turks are at Nicaea, and Nicaea, if you remember, is opposite Constantinople. Basically, it's Newark to Constantinople's New York, so the Byzantines are really, really in trouble. They don't like the Latins. They've kind of been in schism with them since the middle of the century. They never liked them anyway. But now they're really got their backs up against the wall, and so the Byzantine emperors start to ask the Westerners for help, and specifically to the popes, because they see the popes as the leaders of Western Christendom. And so both Gregory VII and then later on Urban II receive appeals for help from the Byzantine emperor, and so they come up with this idea of harnessing the ferocious, violent power of the elite of Western Europe and turning it against Islam, in the hope that this will earn the everlasting gratitude of the Byzantines and end the Great Schism. So one of the funny things about the Middle Ages is that the popes are able to do so much, and they're so powerful in the Middle Ages because the Byzantines have gone into schism, and so they're the only patriarch left in town. So the distinction between the patriarchal power of the Pope and his power as universal pastor is kind of obliterated by the fact that the rump of the church, which is nonetheless bigger than the rest of it, is now the Roman Patriarchate. But on the other hand, the popes are painfully aware throughout the Middle Ages that this is deeply inappropriate, and that they ought to have the Greeks all back in communion with them, and that it undermines, the nature of the church and so they're desperate to end the Great Schism, but ironically it's the Great Schism which is why they're so immensely powerful, because they don't have, whereas previously their power had been greatly mitigated by the fact that they didn't want to annoy the emperors and they didn't want to drive the other patriarchs into schism by throwing their weight around too much. After 1054, they've lost the other guys anyway, so they've got nothing to lose. So that's why the popes are so powerful, and yet they're desperate to end this situation, which is why they invent the idea of the Crusade. Now, but Gregory VII, cutting back to Gregory VII, in 1074, he makes a declaration basically saying that there's already very bad relations between the emperor and the papacy because the emperors are being muscled out of the papal elections, which they're very annoyed about, and there have been several anti-popes arising as a result of that. But now Gregory VII says it's absolutely forbidden, it's a heresy, it's wicked for a lay ruler to be investing a bishop with crozier and ring, and the emperors see this as like a vicious attack on their power base. It's like a mortal fight now with the papacy, and it caused this huge thing called Investiture Controversy, and it causes Gregory VII to eventually he excommunicates and declares deposed the Emperor Henry IV. Henry IV declares Gregory VII deposed and tries to create his own anti-pope. And so you've got a full, and no pope had ever before. Now, as we've spoken about in the past, it's built into the logic of what happened in the coronation of 800, that ultimately the Pope trumps the Emperor, and he can make the Emperor, so by implication he can unmake the Emperor. But no one's ever said that before. But Gregory VII goes out and says it. He says, "Oh, you can't do that. I don't care how important it is to the structure of your own kingdom. You're not investing bishops with ring and crozier. That's a spiritual power. This is simony. It's a heresy. Stop it. And if you don't stop it, I'm going to excommunicate you. And if I excommunicate you, you're not part of Christian society, so you're no longer the emperor, because you can't be the ruler of Christian society if you're not part of Christian society." So, and he issues this document called the Dictatus Papae, which is absolutely kind of, I think he was on something when he wrote it. I mean, it's the most shouty declaration of papal authority that's really probably ever been issued. And it's got these amazing, it's like a list of really shouty statements. And it's got these things in like, "Of the Roman pontiff shall all princes kiss the feet," and the Roman pontiff is undoubtedly made a saint by the merits of St. Peter. Obviously, he'd forgotten about those popes in the previous century, and he may have meant just for the second that he becomes pope, and then he can return to his former ways. But and he says that the Roman pontiff can. It explicitly says in the Dictatus Papae the Roman pontiff can depose emperors. Right. So I mean, it's really this causes a huge kind of sort of spiritual civil war in Christendom, which famously climaxes with the emperor being excommunicated and deposed and having to kneel in the snow for 3 days outside the castle where the Pope is then residing at Canossa, begging him to absolve him. The Pope, which sort of is kind of a great moment of triumph, but is also kind of a semi-Pyrrhic victory, because the Pope knows that he's not sincere at all. So, and sure enough, as soon as he's absolved, he starts back to his old naughty ways. And Gregory VII dies in exile, but he's a saint, so it's okay. And then his successor, but one, Urban II, who's still fighting out with Henry IV, he gets this appeal from the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, "Please save us from the Muslims." So he then says in I think it's November, let's get it right, November 1096, the Council of Clermont, he announces that he's going to that he's going to grant a plenary indulgence, which solves this problem, this mafiosi problem, for all. Well, he says anyone who swears to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims or die in the attempt can receive this kind of sort of plenary indulgence on steroids, basically. So. Not only is it a plenary indulgence, but it substitutes for all penance that you might be given in confession. So normally, if you get a plenary indulgence nowadays, you do your penance, and then you've still got loads of extra time in purgatory, because the priest was supposed to give you 15 years fasting on bread and water, and instead he gave you 10 Hail Marys. So there's a bit of a gap there, which is going to translate into thousands of years in purgatory. So you get the plenary indulgence, but you have to do the 10 Hail Marys. But of course, the 10 Hail Marys back in the 11th century meant 10 years fasting on bread and water, or found 50 monasteries or whatever. So it was a bit more serious. And but this crusading indulgence, you just said, "I've taken the cross," meaning I've sworn to undertake the crusade, and that then substitutes for your penance in confession as well as anything else on top. So they go nuts. They all start chanting "Deus lo vult," God wills it, at the Council of Clermont, and somebody says, "This is a new way of going to heaven." And basically, what it means is we get to go to heaven by killing people, which is what we're actually good at, instead of fasting on bread and water for 15 years. So the aristocracy of Europe are like, yes. So there's this massive, and so it used to be like in the early part of the 20th century, various kind of brain dead rationalist historians used to say that this was, it was all younger sons who wanted to get themselves a plot of land in Palestine or something. That's all complete rubbish. These people bankrupted. A, they weren't younger sons. B, they bankrupted themselves to go on these crusades. They were not in their interest in a temporal sense at all. They did it because it suddenly was a new way of going to heaven. So suddenly But the Pope's in a massive dispute with the King of France and still with the Emperor Henry IV when the First Crusade happens. So it's all the next rank of people who are the backbone of the First Crusade. They're all like dukes and counts and things. They're not kings and emperors. So so that makes it really clear that it's the Pope's army that's going to try and liberate Jerusalem. And absolutely amazingly, and obviously we don't have time to describe the First Crusade, which is an absolutely amazing story, but it would take much too long. But it succeeds, which no one imagined at all. So in July 1099, they take Jerusalem against all the odds. It's an absolutely incredible story. But the Pope's secret agenda, or semi-secret agenda, which was to win back the Byzantines by making them incredibly grateful for having been rescued from the Muslims, doesn't work because although it works to start with, they all go over to Constantinople and they slowly get there, and the Emperor Alexius Comnenus, a bit shocked. He thought like a small band of mercenaries was coming, not thousands of Frankish warriors or Norman warriors, unwashed and inebriated and extremely violent. But he thinks, okay, we'll try and work with this. So he gets them to swear an oath that any Roman territory which they liberate from Islam, they will restore to him. Now, in fact, that basically means any territory they get, because any territory they could possibly have any interest in or any chance of capturing at one time was in the Roman Empire. So it's a pretty good deal. So they get Nicaea back, and then they fight their way against all the odds across Asia Minor, and then they get to Antioch, one of the patriarchal sees and the first city where the followers of our Lord were called Christians. Mm-hmm. And they're besieging Antioch, and it's looking a bit desperate, and they can't properly encircle it, and it looks like they're going to be done in. And then they hear that there's a huge Muslim relief army coming to attack them, and because initially they'd done quite well because nobody expected people to turn up like this out of the blue, and so they caught the Muslim rulers on the hop. But by the time they got to Antioch, they were like, hang on, this is looking a bit dangerous. So the ruler of Mosul sends quite a big army to go and take them out while they're besieging Antioch. And the siege is not as good as it might be because they can't encircle Antioch very easily. And so it looks like they're doomed. And one of the crusaders, called Stephen of Blois, decides to run away effectively. And while so let's leave Stephen of Blois running away, and while then one of the crusaders, who's a Norman called Bohemond, manages to get them inside. Those clever moves. He gets them inside Antioch just in time before the relief army arrives, and then they apparently supposedly discover the relic of the Holy Lance, and they get very excited. But they decide they can't stay in Antioch because all the food's been eaten by the people in Antioch while they were besieging them themselves. There's this huge relief army outside, so they decide to do a kind of desperate, it's a 1,000,000 to 1 chance, Captain, but I just make work sort of maneuver, and they charge out of Antioch, and they win this incredible victory and destroy this Muslim army, and with holding the Holy Lance in front of them, and it's amazing, and they're completely pumped up after this, but meanwhile, naughty Stephen of Blois run away. And while he's running away, he bumps into the Emperor Alexius Comnenus, who's coming with a big Roman army to help deliver the Crusaders in their moment of need, which is great. This is exactly the sort of thing that Urban II was hoping for. They're all going to become pals on the battlefield, and the Great Schism will end and all that kind of thing. And but instead, Stephen of Blois sees Alexius. I don't know whether he genuinely thinks the Crusaders are probably already dead, or he doesn't kind of really want the Crusaders to be rescued by Alexius because that'll make him look terrible. So he tells Alexius, look, there's no point. There's a huge army coming. It's probably already arrived. They're almost certainly dead. If you go there now, you'll just get killed as well, and it'll be a catastrophe. You've really just got to go home. And Alexius buys this and goes home. And basically, Stephen of Blois is responsible for the fact that the Orthodox Church is in existence and is not part of the Catholic Church. Because if Alexius just carried on, and if he'd gone with the Crusaders from Antioch to Jerusalem, and they'd stormed Jerusalem with the emperor from Constantinople, there'd be no Great Schism there. Everyone would be pals, and it'd be marvelous. Instead, the Crusaders are like renounced their vows that they made to the emperor. They're like, the scumbag abandoned us, and then God saved us with the Holy Lance, and that shows that Greeks are evil, treacherous gits, and God loves the Latins, and So the Greeks don't, the Greeks are not the Byzantines, the Romans are not are not as enthusiastic about the liberation of Jerusalem as they might be, because their role in the story is not particularly edifying, and the Latins have decided that the Byzantines are utterly perfidious, and so in the end, catastrophically, the Crusades become this kind of running sore of hostility between the Latins and the Byzantines, instead of being the means of reconciliation, climaxing with the Fourth Crusade going rogue and sacking Constantinople. But anyway, we haven't got time to talk about that. But so anyway, so these are the different institutions you've got going, right? You've got you've got to have freedom of election, universal papal jurisdiction, religious orders, the Crusades, and connected to the Crusades, this new ideal of chivalry, that you shouldn't attack non-combatants and that you shouldn't fight on holy days, and this is all part of the package of the Gregorian Reform Movement. And when Western Europe hears about the fact that Jerusalem has been liberated by the Crusade, which is very much, as I say, because there's no kings or emperors involved, it's very much seen as the Pope's army. So it's the ultimate vindication of the Gregorian Reform Movement. And it famously, it's described by a contemporary as the greatest event since the resurrection. So people are going absolutely nuts when Jerusalem is liberated. So it's the total vindication of the Gregorian Reform Movement. I mean, the Pope has definitively won the propaganda battle. Poor old Urban II, well, he has the beatific vision because he's blessed Urban II, but he doesn't find out while he's alive that Jerusalem's been liberated, because although he is still alive when it's liberated, news does not reach Rome until he's already dead. But so it looks like it's all going to be a great big happy ending, but there's a kind of sort of scourging of the Shire, little damp squib beforehand, because Urban II is succeeded by Pascal II, and Pascal II doesn't have the kind of balls of steel of Urban II and Gregory VII, he kind of backs the son of Henry IV is quarrelling with his father, and he's pretending to be on the side of the popes in the hope of stealing the imperial title from his dad. This is the Emperor Henry V, and he manages to get his father definitively deposed just a year before his father dies in 1105, and he gets himself elected emperor. And so it's all looking good, because he's made lots of nice promises to the popes in order to pull this maneuver off. But as soon as he's in situ, in control of the German kingdom, he loses all interest in the Gregorian Reform Movement, and he's like, oh yeah, I want to control the bishops, because otherwise how am I going to control the kingdom? So he turns out to be utterly treacherous, and then in 1111 he goes down to Rome itself to be crowned by Pascal II, and Pascal II kind of panics, because Henry V is a real bully, and so he offers this slightly crazy deal, sort of idealistic but misconceived deal, whereby if Henry V renounces the right of investiture completely, he will hand over to Henry V all the temporal power and wealth of the church in the whole of Germany. But I mean, that will basically place, so it's all very idealistic, basically turn the whole of the German church into observant Franciscans, but that's not really going to work, and all it'll really mean is it'll turn the German church into the Church of England, and they'll just be completely in the power of the emperor, and so the Roman population are not happy about this. They see this as a stupid, short-sighted thing, and they start rioting. And in the course of the rioting, which mars the coronation of Henry V, Henry V kidnaps Pascal II and bullies him into agreeing to allow the right of lay investiture of bishops. So he's not only conceded the loss of all the temporals, but now he's allowed the thing that it was supposed to be for. And this causes a huge row, lots of people all over Europe accusing the Pope of heresy. So Pascal II is actually ends up as one of those popes who's been accused of heresy historically, and he's denounced famously. Saint Bruno, the abbot of not the Carthusian Bruno, Saint Bruno, the abbot of Monte Cassino, denounces him as a heretic for having accepted lay investiture, and various local bishops and synods and things denounce him. And eventually he once the although he swore an oath not to excommunicate Henry V, once Henry V leaves Italy, Pascal II sheepishly denounces the deal that he struck. So, which of course renews the great quarrel with the papacy until finally, in 1122, with the help of the great canonist Saint Ivo of Chartres, it's worked out that. And also because they've struck similar deals to avoid these kind of problems with the French king and the English king, they work out this deal whereby there will be a ceremony that doesn't involve the ring and the crozier, by which the emperor will be shown to have invested the bishops in Germany with their temporal powers and lands, but not with the office of being a bishop. And then the election will be free, but will take place in the presence of the emperor, so that he can kind of, exercise a certain amount of influence by raising an eyebrow or scratching a head when different candidates are being discussed. But technically it'll be free. And the actual liturgical act of investing the bishop will not involve any kind of lay ruler. So they basically work out this deal between Pope Calixtus II and the Emperor Henry V. And this is called the Concordat of Worms, or Worms, it's written, but Worms, it's pronounced. And so at that point, so the popes have kind of won. There's still going to be lots of fighting, but they've kind of won all their things in principle. They've got the First Crusade, liberated Jerusalem. They've established the Code of Chivalry. They've established the principle of universal papal jurisdiction. They've tamed the emperors to some extent, and they've got rid of lay investiture. And so they do the ultimate, as it were, declaration of papal supremacy, which is they summon an ecumenical council off their own bat, with no reference to either the emperor in Constantinople or the emperor Henry V, and the council meets in the Lateran Basilica, which is the cathedral of Rome and the residence of the popes at this time and for most of papal history until the Avignon papacy. And so that is the First Lateran Council. There's about 300 bishops there, and basically they issued 22 or so canons. There's some dispute about the numbers, different manuscript traditions, but those canons essentially set in disciplinary ecumenical stone all of those ideals: the truth of God, the principle that you don't fight on holy days; the peace of God, the principle that you don't attack non-combatants; the crusade, the celibacy of the clergy, the indulgence, the crusading indulgence, and this resolution to the Investiture Controversy. So all those ideals of the Gregorian Reform Movement, which is really what the papacy that has existed as an institution since that time, since the Gregorian Reform Movement, is created. The papacy that we live under now, as it were, is a creation of the Gregorian Reform Movement, as opposed to the much more limited and cautious papacy of the first millennium. This imperial papacy of the second millennium is very much created in the fires of the Gregorian Reform Movement by the opportunity given by the Great Schism. Despite their desperation to end the Great Schism, they're able to achieve these ideals because of it, and it's the very fact that they hold an ecumenical council shows the plenitude of papal power that they understand themselves to have, and they canonize those ideals in the disciplinary canons. There aren't any dogmatic canons. The disciplinary canons of the First Lateran Council, and the Easterners had developed this idea of the pentarchy, that in order to have a proper ecumenical council, you needed the 5 patriarchs of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. But that idea was made up by the Emperor Justinian, basically. At the time of Nicaea, there were only 3 patriarchies. The term itself is quite late, but the idea, there were 3 of these super bishops of the Council of Nicaea: Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. Constantinople just stole the title because they were the imperial capital, and Jerusalem managed to get it in kind of bargaining around the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon. They sold their support for the winning side in exchange for being declared to be a patriarchate. So the pentarchy, supposed pentarchy, is an invention of the late 5th century, or the mid 5th century, but the Byzantines had kind of held on to it as a kind of way of weakening the power of the papacy. But the popes are saying, pentarchy, we're not really bothered. Basically, it's all about popes and bishops, and being a patriarch is just bells and whistles. What really matters is or bishop, and an ecumenical council is when we summon all the bishops to a big council in our church, and we tell you what you're going to do, and then you vote for it, and you have a nice little cocktail party afterwards. And so that's that model, the imperial papacy, which is more defensible than the idea of this supposed pentarchy, is basically comes into existence as the climax of this opening stage of the Gregorian Reform Movement. Really, it's the climax of the Gregorian Reform Movement. From that point onwards, from 223 onwards, the high medieval papacy is defending that ideal rather than establishing it. It has been definitively established with the acts of the First Lateran Council. So there you are.
Oh, wow.
Lateran 1.
Very good. Well, Doc, we'll see you next time for what's next?
Lateran 2, probably 3, and we'll probably do 2, 3, and 4, because otherwise it'll get too complicated.
We don't want that now, do we? No. Doc, as always, appreciate it. We'll talk to you then.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.